But it's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker of the morning, and that is Dan Bartel. Dan Bartel, CPO of American Airlines. Dan has only been with American Airlines for a short while. Previous to that, he was the CPO, as many of you will know, of Schneider Electric, where he did a wonderful job, multi-award-winning job at that organization. He's laser-focused on many of the issues I've already spoken about. He's an advisory board member of Procurement Leaders as well, and he's going to share a few thoughts about his own journey, but also a few challenges of where we as a function really need to get to as well. So please welcome to the stage, Dan Bartel.
If you want to run away with me, I know a galaxy and I can take you for a ride.
Good morning. So as David said, I'm the CPO of American Airlines, right? And I've been serving on the advisory board of Procurement Leaders for 5 or 6 years now. I just want to say up front that I had nothing to do with this phrase, glide path for Horizon 2030. That wasn't me. Still, I'm going to lean heavily into this aviation analogy as the subject of my talk this morning. Since I've been doing procurement for quite a long time, nearly 30 years, I'll take excerpts from my own personal journey along the way that hopefully you can draw inspiration and at least some learning from. I don't want to make this speech entirely about me, although that is one of my favorite subjects. I think there's value in looking back. There's value in looking back on the early days when we were mainly a back office function, right? Examine a little bit how we've evolved into this strategic function that delivers value, innovation, competitive advantage for our companies, right? And the best way I can think to do that is to draw on my own personal experience. So that's all well and good. But what about the future, right? Where are we going in the future as a function? I'll give you my thoughts about all of that in a few minutes, but I hope over the course of this short talk this morning, I can inspire you about the possibilities of the future for your company, for your career. And before we get there, let's again step back, think about where we've been, how we got to where we are, and where do we go from here. So let's go back to the beginning. The earliest records of aviation date back to 475 BC in China, where the people started flying kites in the shape of birds. In China today, kites are still really important. They're more than just toys. They symbolize people's aspiration for freedom, for health, and for longevity. Fast forward a couple of thousand years, and we see the first real studies of flight with the more than 100 drawings by Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci's designs were supposedly never built, but they effectively illustrated his theories about how man could potentially fly. He helped us believe that it's possible. And that's a really important lesson for us procurement leaders. All of us see problems every day in our working life. Many of us are able to frame those problems as opportunities in our own minds, but only the best procurement leaders are able to illustrate to the rest of the C-suite the art of the possible, and to convince them to empower procurement to drive value in unconventional ways. Now, the hot air balloon, that's the first successful human-carrying flight technology. The first untethered manned hot air balloon flight in the world was performed not far from here in Paris on November 22nd, 1783, in a balloon created by the Montgolfier brothers. It was unpowered, it was uncontrolled, but it was successful, flying more than 9 kilometers in a period of about 25 minutes. And I think this is a good point to draw back to my own personal timeline and make a connection. The year was 1996. I was just named as a buyer for semiconductors at Rockwell Automation. And you can say I too was unpowered, uncontrolled, but I was successful enough, I think. You can say my career got off the ground, but really at this stage it was only going where the wind was blowing me. And that's quite evident in the focus, or lack thereof, that I had on these 5 glide paths that David was talking about. Just thinking back, I was a buyer in a factory. My main job was to get the right part in the right place at the right time at a reasonable enough cost, right? Quite typical, I would say, of procurement expectations at the time. When you think about these glide paths that we're aspiring to work on today, most of them just weren't on the radar. I couldn't spell ESG at the time, had no idea what it even was. Performance, again, was mainly about making sure we get the right part in the right place. Manage cost and cash when you have the time. Digitalization was practically non-existent. I was printing out and mailing purchase orders. So I think enough said about digitalization. It didn't exist. And resilience was really focused on recovery. We weren't doing much in ways of prevention. So the bottom line is no one was asking us to do those things. Continuing a bit on the aviation timeline, December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers successfully built and launched the first powered and crewed heavier-than-air flight, right? This is universally recognized as the date that launched modern aviation. It was the first powered aircraft that controlled all three axes of flight, pitch, yaw, and roll. This was easily, hands down, the biggest breakthrough in commercial aviation history. Now back to my personal timeline. It was 1999, I was still working at Rockwell, and they had hired their very first chief procurement officer, a gentleman named Jim Hart. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work directly for him in a number of different roles. The executive focus and the longer-term strategic thinking that Jim brought to the table, including like his proverbial seat at the table, it was a game changer for the company, game changer for our function. But this is still early in the, say, development of procurement, and in the context of what is expected from procurement today, we were barely getting that plane off the runway. ESG still not a focus. When it comes to performance, the focus pivoted to cost reduction as a high priority. We started to do some supplier scorecarding. Digitization actually did start to develop a little bit. We stopped mailing POs. We started faxing them, so pretty fancy technology. Even some emailing of purchase orders in the late 90s. And again, resilience, not much of a focus. So things slowly starting to develop. And when it comes to aviation, post-Wright brothers into World War I, World War II, the development of technology really started to accelerate. Airplanes evolved from low-powered biplanes made from wood and fabric to these sleek, high-powered monoplanes made out of aluminum. In the years that followed their first flight, the Wright brothers started traveling overseas, sharing their innovations with other aviation inventors, serving to substantially advance technological development for the industry. And by the end of the Second World War, the Germans had invented and industrialized the first jet-powered aircraft. So some real acceleration. Now back to my own personal timeline. I can link this to my time more than 20 years ago in Danaher, which at the time was a quite unknown industrial company. My main task there was, like the Wright brothers, to travel overseas, develop suppliers, substantially advance the mission to drive costs down. It was all about cost. It was the heyday of internationalism, emerging market sourcing. Back then, we wouldn't move something offshore unless it generated at least 30 to 40% savings. Over the course of a few years, you could say that procurement was the jet aircraft powering the bottom line of the company. And while we were driving some incredible financial results, the focus on the 5 glide paths at this stage was still mixed, I would say. ESG, you could say we were actually going backwards. We were increasing the carbon footprint of the supply chain by making it longer. Partnerships became much more challenging to develop because we were working with a lot more suppliers that were much farther away offshore. Performance, while we weren't super balanced, we were driving a massive amount of financial performance to the bottom line of the company. Digitization started to evolve more. Just out of necessity, we had to make extra efforts with digitization to stay closer to those partners that were offshore. And for resilience, again, you could say that we were making things worse, making the supply chain even longer.
Not sail now, but for
Can we kill the sound on that?
Trusting the first flight by a British
Thank you.
airline.
So continuing on the aviation timeline, end of World War II, there was an era of economic development that was unprecedented, right? That really enabled the advancement of the jet age. Commercial aviation was expanding rapidly at this stage, but it wasn't cheap, right? As of 1971, fewer than half of Americans had ever flown on an airplane. That said, you could say that the beginning of the jet age had arrived, and the future was pretty bright. In my own personal journey, I link this to my time at Thomas & Betts, where I had my real first CPO assignment. It was only a $1 billion spend, a rather small plane, if you will, and not so multinational, but for the first time in my career, I was in the pilot seat. It was a company that was depending really heavily on raw materials, which opened up some opportunity for procurement to contribute in some really unconventional ways. And in my mind, looking back, This was the beginning of my own personal jet age in my career. Still, no focus on ESG at that stage. Maybe to talk a bit about resilience. When we tried to change suppliers to cut the cost, we were told it wasn't possible, too challenging, too technically risky to qualify a second source. And that was a really big risk exposure that was not perceived that way by the senior leadership. So I worked really hard to paint the picture for the executive leadership, the extent to which the entire supply chain was at risk, having so many single-sourced, single-location suppliers. And they mostly bought into a new strategy of systematically double-sourcing all the raw materials. So I was given a license to deploy it gradually, each additionally approved source increasing competition, driving the cost down, and producing savings that can be reinvested into the next round of qualifications. From a performance standpoint, the cost went way down, increased the competition, quality up, since we now had alternatives to the core supply base. But the real impact on performance wasn't just the lower pricing. It was a management process for cost management that was led by procurement that was super innovative. Commodity costs in this business were fluctuating a lot, right? And no one in the organization was taking end-to-end responsibility for how do we pass those increases and decreases onto the market. So procurement, we identified that gap. We took it as an opportunity to not only solve a problem, but make our function more relevant. By the end, procurement was practically responsible for leading the process of setting the selling prices. It was a really good example of where procurement identified a gap, stepped in to fill it, and the ability to identify cross-functional process gaps and the courage to step up and fill those gaps is a massive opportunity for procurement to increase the relevance in the company. So coming back to aviation, I mentioned a few minutes ago that in 1971, fewer than half of Americans had ever been on an airplane. As of last year, that number was more than 90%. American Airlines alone, we're flying 200 million people a year on over 6,000 flights a day. Commercial aviation is available to most, and it's also essential for the global economy. And that's exactly where procurement as a function is today. We are essential. Essential for the success of any company, in any industry, and essential for the success of the global economy overall. So I think in my personal timeline, this is a great point to stop and talk about Schneider Electric. David mentioned this is where I was prior to American Airlines, having left just in January of this year. I started there in 2019, and when you think about procurement in Schneider, it's absolutely essential to the success of that company. They invested substantially in the function, and they certainly create competitive advantage in the market through their supply chain, including their suppliers. Now, this shouldn't be interpreted as like a super accurate assessment of the maturity of Schneider procurement, but I do believe that they do most of these things at a world-class level in today's terms. If you're looking for a company to benchmark in any of these areas, I can recommend you talking to somebody at Schneider. Schneider is widely seen as one of the most sustainable companies in the world. Their procurement leans into that really heavily with groundbreaking programs on carbon reduction, on decent work for suppliers that few, if any, companies dare to embark on. And they're delivering on those results. I was CPO of Schneider during some of the most difficult times in the modern era of supply chain. COVID lockdowns, labor shortages crippled our supply base. At one point, we had more than 1,000 suppliers completely shut down. And we suffered the worst semiconductor crisis ever. It was a supply-constrained environment.